wanted to start by talking about the significance of this funding. Lena, what does this Prop C funding represent in terms of San Francisco's ability to meaningfully reduce the humanitarian crisis that is unsheltered homelessness in San Francisco?
Well, I think it's giving a lot of us hope. And I think people are feeling really hopeless about, the state of homelessness right now and the number of people who are in crisis. We saw with COVID, San Francisco was able to do some amazing things. I'm not exactly sure about this number, but at least in the Tenderloin where we do the tent counts, it was reduced, I think about 80%. With Prop C dollars, particularly, the permanent supportive housing and the emergency shelters, I think, it's looking like we may have an opportunity to really transform homelessness, if not eliminate it in San Francisco. I'm a little nervous about saying that, but I feel like if we did it within a few months because of COVID with some additional resources, I feel very hopeful that we're able to do it.
Thank you. Brett, I want to ask kind of specifically about the impact of this funding on mental health services in San Francisco specifically. Can you tell me what this Prop C funding will do for mental health services in San Francisco that we know are often linked to homelessness?
Yeah, thank you very much, Erin. And I just wanted to say hi to my Our City, Our Home member, Dr. Miller. Good to see you. We just wrapped up a 2-hour meeting a couple of days ago talking about all this good stuff. Here's what I think about it, and I pay attention to it, and I wear a few hats here, and I'm speaking from as a longstanding HIV service provider, as a longstanding executive director over the years, and certainly being here in San Francisco for the last 18 running PRC. I believe that the city does an extraordinary job of identifying resources to address the particular issue. I believe that we also could do a greater job of putting strategy to it. And so with the investment of these Prop C dollars, with Our City, Our Home dollars, along with what I am seeing, at least in the meetings that I'm sitting in, significant effort towards the strategy of what we could do for addressing homelessness, but how it works in partnership with the work that we already have done for many years that may very well need augmenting through resources, restructuring in order to make sure that we just don't serve people on the downstream. That's a big conversation that I'm having all the time. It's a constant refrain. Before this, I was a youth service director, and I always say somehow we always want to serve the person once they're disenfranchised, once they're marginalized, but we've spent less time figuring out preventative and intervention measures to make sure that they're there. So I would say these funds are important because there is thought and strategy being put to it that arguably hasn't been put to it in many years. Being able to be very innovative and creative with these local dollars is what is significantly meaningful. One last thing I'd say, Erin, it's reminding me of how we raised money in the HIV community where we were looking for general funds because government dollars were so restrictive that there was only a way in which you could provide a service at a different type. And there was always a group of people who didn't meet that eligibility. And I want to use a page from the learnings from that playbook to make sure that we are as broad thinking and innovative with these dollars as possible. So I'm looking forward to this infusion and this investment in the behavioral health system of care because we've studied it, we understand it, we understand what our goals are, and now the work is ahead of us, and it's our commitment to get it done.
Thanks, Brett. You brought up a good point about the tension between unrestricted dollars and funding for specific programs, and I want to get back to that a little bit later in the discussion. But Chris, Brett also brought up a good point talking about how we rethink the delivery of homeless services and housing for as a whole in San Francisco, from prevention all the way to permanent supportive housing and everything in between. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the vision for how this funding will change San Francisco's approach to addressing homelessness and how it differs from what San Francisco is already doing, or maybe it just augments what it's already doing or fills it out in a different way.
Oh, you're on.
Oh, you're on
I
mute.
promise not to do that during this panel.
We'll all do it at some
Got
point.
it out of the way. Got it out of the
Tell
way.
from the gray beard, I'm old, so this is all new to me. I guess the best frame maybe is what Brett mentioned about the AIDS crisis. And as somebody who lived through the AIDS crisis in San Francisco, I think what it taught us is that you can have a situation that looks entirely hopeless, where there doesn't seem to be any solution in sight. And you can keep working on that problem with the faith that there's no option but to solve it and to address it because people's lives are at stake. And you can start to do a number of things, some of which won't work. And at the end of the day, if you stay committed to it, you can do something remarkable. And I don't mean to be naive. There is still an AIDS crisis, particularly for some particular populations, particularly for Black and brown folks who still suffer and don't, and our efforts have not been as successful as they need to be. That being said, our response to the AIDS crisis, I think, is a good example of increasingly what our response to homelessness is in San Francisco. So that gives me a lot of hope. And what Prop C and the pandemic did was it took away all of our excuses, right? So what the pandemic taught us is that, and we knew this, those that deal with homeless people every day, but homeless people want to be housed. I think 85% of people offered housing in the Tenderloin took it, and took it that day, grabbed their stuff and moved inside. So this kind of myth that there's this whole thousands of people who just want to be outside in the cold, getting rained on regularly, that's not true. Secondly, we have the resources to effectively address the issue, right? We have the resources. And then thirdly, we have the infrastructure if we deploy it right, because within a very short period of time, we housed 2,000 people. And I'm not saying it was easy or that people didn't work incredibly hard to make it happen, but it happened. And so now what we have is, so we have a situation where we don't have any excuses. And then what has happened largely as a result of Prop C and similar to the AIDS crisis is we have a multi-pronged strategy. We're not relying on one solution or another. So if you look, for instance, at the housing interventions that are currently at play in the city, you have permanent supportive housing vacancies. We're going to buy more hotels and motels, maybe not SIP hotels, but we're going to buy more hotels and motels. We have rapid rehousing. We have flex pool. We have short-term housing subsidy. So there's a number of interventions, and we're going to apply those interventions in a system that we know can work with people that we know want to be housed.
Thanks, Chris, for that. You talked about the no excuses approach, and one of the things that I think about a lot is how HSH and the city writ large is going to be able to absorb all of this money. It's a lot of money really fast, right? So there's a lot of capacity building that has to happen to get that money out the door, to get those contracts approved, to get those sites acquired and built. So can you tell me a little bit about how HSH is preparing for this money and how it plans to make the most of it, to really be able to get that money out the door and to be serving the folks it's meant to be serving?
Well, first of all, a supportive plug for HSH as it specifically relates to our rehousing effort in SIP hotels. I came to form a rehousing group because it was felt that this was a particular moment in time and the effort had to scale. So we needed to create another entity to scale that effort, right? But when we came to do that work, when I came to do that work and put together a team, there was already a remarkable piece of work that had already been done. So we already had a by name list of everyone in the hotel. So we had everyone in the hotel. We knew their name, and they had all been assessed. So we knew not only their name and all of their pertinent information, but what kind of housing intervention they would benefit from. And we had those interventions already funded and identified. So that was the foundation on which we built. And as you know, over the last 3 months, there's been some significant change at HSH. And as a matter of fact, we're moving back to the rehousing group as a group is moving to HSH because the COVID command center is demobilizing, as it were. And I think that what you'll see is that HSH is clearly positioned to do the staffing and build the organization necessary to significantly to effectively utilize those dollars. And it's not going to be easy. I don't want to be naive about this. It's a huge lift, but there's a recognition that that HSH, right, has to have the capacity in order to do that. So it has to build on the existing capacity, and there's a great focus on that, and that's happening.
Great. Brett, this is kind of a related, oh, go ahead. Did you want to add something?
I actually you may be headed, I may have jumped the gun and headed in a question that you would have been asking me, but I just wanted to say a word very much on what Chris was talking about in response to your original question. How is behavioral health services, DPH, and such going to utilize these dollars? It is a significant infusion of resources in cash. A few things that I will say about that. There already have been studies, and good thanks to Mayor Breed for convening the mental health reform task force. I was honored to be a part of that. From that report, head by Dr. Anton Nagusa-Bland, there were critical issues that were identified and a series of recommendations that were made that are already being implemented. So I wanted to just say that there is analysis that is being done. There's mental health SF in partnership, and this is the beauty of living in San Francisco. Politics, I understand, can sometimes be a blood sport, and at times you can find common ground around particular things. And then the grand negotiation between the mayor's office and the board of supervisors, we have mental health SF that identified key strategies that they were looking to implement over the coming years that are going to be in partnership with this. So the analysis has been done. The framework in many ways is there. And now it is about making sure that these resources address what has already been identified. And so that is the exciting piece of it, is that we sort of know what we need to do, and now we have the resources to do it. I will say this, and I've said this in our City, Our Home meetings as late as, was it Tuesday, Lena? Was our meeting Tuesday? You know how these days go by. I add just one cautionary tale to make sure that there is parity in services between those that are homeless or experiencing homelessness and those who are at risk of being homeless or maybe will never be homeless, that they deserve and should have the same set of services, because there's always some level of wraparound services that are going to be there and should be there, and often aren't there in a way in which it meets the needs of the client or the individual. And so I just want to make sure that when we think of Our City, Our Home, and you mentioned the big numbers, the multi-millions and hundreds of millions, if not close to billion, that the city will continue to make its investments for those who may not be homeless, to make sure that the services are in parity. Because as I said in the meeting on Tuesday, there were times when there was created HIV exceptionalism, and there were sets of services that just weren't out there in the general community, where it was a rich model of care that we were providing, but it wasn't a model of care that everyone could access. And I know firsthand, because I'm with PRC, when people would walk in the lobby and say, hey, I'm here for emergency financial assistance, or I'm here for legal advocacy and benefits counseling, and they weren't positive, how heartbreaking it was to have to say, those are for positive individuals. And so that's the conversation that I'm never wanting to have, and making sure that we on the front end incorporate that kind of integration to make sure that one person who may be homeless or not has the same access to services to to help them stabilize their life and help and get to good health and well-being, and have a home. And so that's my word that I would say about that. But back to really the framework and the analysis, it's there. We now have the resources to do what we need to do for the homeless population. That population needs to, the services being provided need to match the services of those who are housed. So that's really where my focus is.
One of the challenges that I know that we've talked about, Brett, are just the salaries to pay service providers and social workers, needing to be competitive enough so that these folks can actually afford to live in San Francisco, right? How do wages play into the city's ability to provide adequate mental and behavioral health care for folks who need it? And does Prop C address this issue in any way?
Well, here I'm looking at Lena, because Lena launched at the last meeting, late in the meeting, and I could have stayed on another hour. And I'm always one for time. And we have had a constant conversation about this. Here's what is to be said and what is true and has remained true, certainly over the time that I've been here. It has become increasingly difficult to frankly live here in San Francisco. It has become incredibly difficult to work in a sector, for us, a nonprofit sector, when in many ways, while we love the city and we're partnered with them, we are also in competition with them and often are on the short end of the stick of it. So what can we do? What strategies can we design? What tactics can we deploy to make sure that we are competitive in the workplace, to recruit and retain these individuals? So over time, it has been incredibly hard, Erin, to keep people employed, to keep people living here in the city. We're watching an out-migration of individuals who are driving in from Pleasanton and driving in, as far as Sacramento, because they frankly can't live here in the city. So, my proposition and my dream and hope is that we can, in some public-private way, create a partnership between the nonprofit sector, the city, possibly through their HR department, and our local universities and colleges, to create a pipeline of individuals who are interested in, wanting to, desirous of working in a field that is rich and rewarding and very much speaks to the values of San Francisco. And it's in my head. I've had it a couple times and I've said it, and I'm going to keep saying it until somebody's willing to come to the table. Hopefully those three factions come together and figure out what it is, because as I said in the meeting, and Lena knows I said it, I said, money doesn't provide the service, people provide the service. And we need the money to train the people, and those people need to be trained up and skilled and appropriate to provide the highest level of care to the individuals who are vulnerable and need them the most. And so that's my commitment. I believe we have set aside what is quite a modest amount, and I would say a placeholder amount, on workforce development, which is training and emotional support and ways in which people can skill up in their jobs and find support as they do this very, very difficult work, because it's, as you know, it is very complex and often not as rewarding as many other jobs that we see out, or acknowledged, I should say, as many other jobs. So I'll leave it there. I know Lena's ready to pick it up.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. Lena, I did want to open it up to you to add on to that.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, I think it's really a reflection of our values. I mean, people say they care about homelessness. They say they, care about underserved populations, but, we've had to fight. We've had to fight really hard for wages. Our average wage that we pay people in our villages, our safe sleeping villages, is $26 an hour. We were able to get that wage because at the time when we were asked to take on the first SIP hotels, no other provider would do it. Everybody was sheltering in place. But often people, despite our outstanding work and outcomes, everyone kind of approaches us like we're supposed to be a discount service. They want top rated service. You have almost no room for error, but nobody wants to really pay. It's almost like, and I think this is a big problem with, services for underserved populations, particularly unsheltered populations, is that the work isn't valued. And it's hard, you know, when you're paying someone minimum wage to insist this, you know, really high level of services when you're really dealing with some extremely difficult and complex issues, and you know, complexity of the psyche, right? You know, you take a lot of abuse, you see a lot of really hard things, you know. You have to have an extremely high level of emotional intelligence, you know, to kind of be able to sort through these things. And the wages for people who do social services, particularly for people who work with unsheltered populations, is really low. I think it's really a decision we have to make as a city about how we value the people that do this work. And then we can attach accountability as we have. You know, we pay people well, and what we tell our staff is, look, you get paid the same amount as the people who work at the W or the Hilton, you know, and we expect that the people who live here receive the same level of services, 5-star services. But we're able to do that because we pay well. And so I think it's really the city. I think we've done a good job. We have one of the highest minimum wages, but we also have to look at that sector and say, we're going to have to increase the wages. And with increasing the wages, you increase the level of accountability. Then people value their job because they feel valued, and they're able to, you know, unfortunately, a lot of people who work in homeless services are unsheltered. We have many people who work for us who live in our villages, unfortunately, or live in their cars. Eventually, after working for us for some time, they're able to get a little more stable. But really, I think it's the values of society at large, and it needs to be reflected in those wages, just as we've raised the minimum wage.
Brett, you wanted to add in on that.
Mind if I just jump in on this a little bit, Erin? I'm honored to be one of the co-chairs of the Human Services Network, along with Sherilyn Adams of Larkin Street. And Steve Fields and many others have led the way for many years about the cost of doing business and what that really means. And, you know, to Lena's point, there is some level of demoralization. I'll just call it for what it is, for having to go and go in with hat in hand every year somehow to the city and ask for what seems quite logical, quite reasonable, quite within the realm of reality, and frankly, often reflected in many other contracts across the city with for-profit service providers or for-profit providers, whatever that may happen to be. So I just want to say a word for making most consistent and institutionalizing and making permanent the cost of doing business. I know there's been great work that the mayor did this year by baselining it and putting it in the fiscal 22 budget. Supervisor Haney and Supervisor Ronan, you know, co-headed a hearing on it, talking about a permanent fix. So I know everybody is in agreement. Again, we just have to do it. The other thing that I would say, and we often say this in the nonprofit sector, we've got to make sure that we have a commitment to the minimum compensation ordinance. MCO is sure the right thing. It moves people up to make sure that they have a living wage, but there has to be an investment that comes with that. That's just not magic money that anybody can find in their nonprofit. So again, when we have the conversation about values, make sure you have the fullness of the strategy, which often includes, in theory, funding, but sometimes not in reality. So and, you know, I'm challenging the city to make that as permanent as possible. And then I want to throw in this last thing, and I have a feeling that you have it in, Erin. Just a word about racial equity, because I know often we always want to sort of kind of talk about it, maybe, or they're only waiting for the brown people to talk about it because nobody else wants to talk about it, or who's going to lead it, or who's going to fix it. And I do want to just, before this is all over, touch a little bit on, because it's a part of the policy work that we're doing at PRC.
Well, but that was on my list of questions, and you've now introduced the topic. So how did the Our City, Our Home Committee think about equity in its recommendations and incorporate the principles of equity into the recommendations that it put forward?
I think it's embedded in every one of the proposals. I mean, where I think it's probably where the rubber will meet the road are around the prevention efforts. What are we going to do to make sure that we prevent people from falling into homelessness? Sure, there's a strategy around families and around single adults. There should be a separate strategy for youth, certainly, because we don't want our youth to turn into adult homeless individuals. But I think that we need to spend time. I keep talking about the upstream of it. What can we do to prevent individuals from falling into a space where they find themselves homeless, and then and only then are the services being provided to them? And this is, I understand that this could be tricky and a little provocative, but I'm going to say it. You know, California is a majority minority state. We know that a disproportionate amount of the homeless population in San Francisco are people of color, African American, frankly, the vast majority of them. And to Lena's point around the value of it, if one values a person or an individual, you will do something for them. And on a sliding scale, the less value you have for that person, the less you're willing to put investment and time into that individual. And I'm thinking about HIV. I'm also a proud gay Black man, and I tracked both movements. I'm in the LGBT movement and I'm in the HIV movement, right? And I watched in both scenarios where the population of people who were disproportionately impacted by either one of those, that may be a non-person of color, the general population, and the political will and the interest that fast forwarded marriage equality to where it got to. And I'm glad about that as a gay man. And I'm glad that certainly we figured out what we needed to do in the advancements of medicine, so that we found, you know, a triple combination therapy that keeps many people alive today. But as I've also tracked, and I'm going to be 57, is the browner the issue got, the less interest was there. The browner the issue got in both scenarios, less was there the interest, the will, the funding. And it is my outside observer, couch arm, psychology, sort of sociology observation of it. And this is the piece that I'm paying attention to. Like, are we in the state that we're in with the homeless population partly because it's disproportionately people of color? It's a question that's worth asking. We may not have an answer to it. We may not have empirical data necessarily to support it. Are there systems of racism and histories of racism that have led to this, that there is a precipitous way in which a person of color would fall into homelessness than others? Questions that need to be asked, because I want to stop the pipeline. I don't want us to just figure out how to take care of a bunch of brown people from now until times get better. I want to figure out how to turn the spigot off. And if that means getting in and doing systems change just as much as we're doing programs and reform and creating these wonderful ways in which we can serve people now, then that's what we need to do. And I feel that's where the heavy lifting comes, is to change the historical systems that frankly have provided and supported and abetted racism, systemic racism for years, if not decades and or centuries.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that because, you know, from the standpoint of single adults, where I've done most of my work, single chronic adults, right? It must be racism, because otherwise, if it's not racism, you would have to believe that there's something fundamentally wrong with Black men, because there's no other alternative. Because when Brett talks about the disparities, they are off the charts. I mean, so 5% of the city is African American. 2/3 of homeless adults are African American. So it's not like a little bit of a difference, right? But it is a fundamental criteria for homelessness in San Francisco that you be a Black male. And so the converse of that is, unless we deal with those issues, we don't solve homelessness, right? We still have homelessness as a city. So I want to, yeah, I just want to acknowledge that, because I think if we don't, I mean, not only is it the right thing to do, but if we don't acknowledge it, we don't solve the problem, because it is the problem. And then also to acknowledge that I think that, you know, the challenge with people that have been focused on homelessness around prevention, like traditionally when Brett would talk about going upstream, people would be like, well, that's not our work. That's because we're homeless providers. There's a couple of things that have changed that thinking, I think, fundamentally. Number one, what we've shown in San Francisco is that while we're helping homeless people based on our criteria, we're creating the next group of homeless people that we can help based on the criteria we have. So unless we do what Brett said, and we're uniquely positioned during the next 3 years to do that because of the resources, we'll never catch up. And with homelessness, if you never catch up, then you buy completely into the most expensive solution. Because what not catching up means is that the vast majority of people we house need an extensive set of services because they spent so much time on the streets. So that the other thing just to note is that every year about 1,000 people fall into chronic homelessness, and we house about 1,000 chronically homeless people. Now we're going to house more than that so we can catch up, right? But if we could cut the number of people each year who fall into chronic homelessness through those 7,000 prevention slots that you mentioned at the beginning, then we would see a significant drop in the overall chronic homelessness population, which would then allow us to serve people who are not as chronic and get them into housing, which means that as a city, we wouldn't be continuing to create the homeless people that we're eventually trying to serve. And the good news is there's resources over the next 3 years to actually do what we're suggesting, if we can pull it off.
As you brought, go ahead, Lena. Yeah.
You know, this is something that, you know, that it makes me so angry. It's difficult to talk about. Being from Hunters Point, we watched this happen in slow motion. You know, I remember when, you know, my grandmother and other people would talk about what happened in the Fillmore, and it was a travesty. And 40 years later, people can talk about how horrible it was. But what was the conversation then? I was there in slow motion when this happened in Hunters Point. When all public housing, to me, it's like we're kind of in the middle of this because we're a provider, you know, with all these arguments about what costs what and what's the best kind of emergency shelter service. But really, to me, what people are talking about is public housing. Public housing got torn down, at least in Hunters Point. It all got, you know, taken over. And it was like, oh, we're going to make room for the people who were there. And then there was all these things like the back rent. And if you got caught smoking weed, which now is legal, you get kicked out, all these kinds of things. No one said a word. No, the silence was deafening. And now, surprise, surprise, we have so much homelessness. As somebody, a lifelong resident of San Francisco from Hunters Point, and I see so many people from every part of my life in the Tenderloin, you know, that are unsheltered, it's heartbreaking. And so now we say, well, how did we get here? What happened? When it was happening, nobody said a word. Nobody tried to help, even now. And it makes you wonder, like, what are the things that are going on now that we're silent about, that we don't say much about, that contributes to this? I'm a real fan of Supervisor Walton's reparations initiative. There has to be something more. There's been too much insidious damage that has been done in this city that has resulted in this crisis. And then everyone throws their hands up, and we're all doing the best that we can to make sure that people aren't hurt out there on the streets more every single day, and that they don't incur more damage. But the reality is there was a lot that went into creating this problem. And there's going to be a whole lot more that needs to go into fixing it. I'll just be quiet with that.
I think to your point and to Brett's point, you really can trace the underfunding of public housing from its inception to racism, and see how administrations that that as the proportion of people of color were moving into public housing, I'm talking about in the 50s and 60s, increased, the funding decreased. And so we can really clearly trace that legacy of racism in the housing system that we have today. But I wanted to talk about a different, something that Chris brought up, and I think something that really shaped the Our City, Our Home recommendations. We had one of our audience members came in with a question that this is a person who's experienced homelessness most of their life because of being transgender. And the one thing that they found most disabling about seeking housing help was the circular system, where one agency refers you to another agency and so forth, on and on and on. And eventually just being so frustrated that you give up, right? And so, Chris, you talked about the city being able to pull off this dream. I think one of the things that often gets lost when we talk about big, large amounts of money is the implementation. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the city is really rethinking its systems, coordinated entry, 311, the systems that people who are experiencing homelessness access. And then I also want to talk to Lena and Brett about how people's lived experience shaped these recommendations. But first, Chris, to you.
I was at the park the other day, and there was a homeless person on the bench, and we exchanged some, had a brief conversation, but I was there at the park more, and I was watching him, and after a little while, he picked up a branch. He started to sweep around his area, and then he found an old shirt and he put it in the drinking fountain, and then he cleaned his bench, and he waited until it dried. Then he sat down. And I was watching him do all this, and I was actually, in tears, because I thought, my God, we've created this hugely complex system. All we need to do is give this fella a key so that he can go into his room and sweep his room and clean his sink. And yet the complications of that sometimes are, are real barriers. And so I think that the challenge that we have yet to meet in San Francisco, and there's a lot of reasons for this, right, is that we need to create the distance from a homeless person and the unit has to get as short as possible. When I was working at ECS, we had an access point, and 2 blocks down the road, we had a permanent supportive housing development, right? And I would say, why does it take 2 months to walk 2 blocks, right? And so I think that the challenge that we have yet to meet, and this is not specific to San Francisco, is that if we're going to really solve the problem, we have to get as close to being able to pick up people on the corner and drive them to a unit and figure everything else out later as we possibly can. And that's going to be the deciding factor whether we pull this off or not. How close can we get the unit to the homeless person on the corner? And that's gonna be the deciding factor. The second thing too, that I don't want to be naive about, one of the things that Prop C has done and the pandemic has done is hopefully create the urgency. When the mayor talks about her homeless recovery plan, she always talks about it in this time frame, right? This 2-year time frame. That's really important, right? And that's another deciding or critical factor. If we do this 2-year plan in 4 years, we will not address homelessness because of what we talked about before. We'll just create more homeless people to back up the homeless people that we're housing. So the urgency is to complete this 2-year plan in 2 years. And the only way we're going to do that is by making, as I said, the distance from homelessness to housed as short as possible. And we're all going to have to participate in that. If that's going to be possible, then providers are going to have to take some risks on documentation. And landlords are going to have to take some risks on who they're willing to rent and what kind of ID they need in order to do that. And service providers are going to have to, at least for a period of time, understand that not everyone is going to get absolutely the set of services that we want right away. And so we're all going to have to take some risks in doing things differently, so that the primary emphasis is getting everyone who's outside inside. Because from my perspective, we should get everyone outside inside and figure out the rest later. And to Brett's point, I mean, and we have resources, and not lose at all a focus on making sure that people who are not yet outside but may get there if we don't provide some assistance, that we keep them inside. And sorry to go on and on, but I do want to, you know, there has been some really good research over the last couple of years. The challenge around the upstream work that Brett talks about is that when we didn't have the right targeting strategies, the real concern was that the people we were preventing homelessness for would not have become homeless even if we hadn't provided that intervention. And what I mean to say is that the people most likely to access those prevention services were not necessarily the people who needed them most. But there's been some fundamental research over the last couple of years, which allows us, based on certain characteristics, to target housed people who are housing unstable, who we know have a high likelihood of falling into homelessness without the prevention. So there's lots of hope on the prevention side that we can do a better job of targeting. And again, in service to reducing that chronic number from like 956 every year to less than 500. So we can not only house all the currently chronic people, but get ahead and not create more chronicity because of our strategies. So.
Thanks for that. Lena and Brett, I wanted to ask, just have you share a little bit about how the lived experiences of people who are unhoused shaped these recommendations, and how you incorporated those their ideas into what you presented to the mayor. Can you tell me a little bit about that process and how it shaped those recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a word, and Lena can pick up on this. I mean, what was fundamental and core and priority to the committee was to hear from the community. And so we hosted a series of community listening sessions and had questions that we wanted to ask. And we also had time to hear what was happening. What were the conditions on the ground? What were you experiencing in real time? Access to laundry, access to showers, and hygiene came up so big. We had specific meetings. I sat in one specifically and advocated fiercely, and I'm proud to say that the committee supported it and understood it, and it was successful and made it into the series of recommendations, investment recommendations. The transgender community came together and had a listening session, and a dear friend of mine said, a transgender gal said to me, it was tough for me because there were not even therapists who wanted to touch me, to help me, to understand my story. And so I couldn't get a person to even acknowledge me for who I was. How in the world are they going to then, the larger system, help me with being homeless? And so we identified resources that are specific to clinical care and treatment that are going to be culturally appropriate and meaningful to the transgender community. We did that same thing with Tay. We heard that exact same thing, that they didn't necessarily believe that the person that they were talking to understood what their experience was. And there are many clinicians that are out there that are quite skilled and able to provide, and many of them have even lived their own life experience and lived experience through it all, that I'm excited that we will incorporate into the system of care. So the listening sessions were worth the price of admission. They were more than the value of any white paper or report that you could produce with all of those wonderful people who have lots of suffixes after their name. And so we took that very seriously and incorporated that into our consideration and into our thinking. And I want to say we did our absolute best effort to make sure that those were incorporated into the investments. Lena, I'm going to let you say a word about that, and then I just want to say a little bit about vacant beds and treatment and some of the things that we're doing to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the community.
Thank you, Brent. I think, like I shared with you, I'm from Hunters Point. I think, all of us have experienced a lot of trauma who are around my age and younger. It's almost impossible to get out unscathed. We have family members, people we love, people we grew up with, who are experiencing homelessness. Most of our workforce are in vulnerable situations, have experienced homelessness, or have family members who are out there, who they walk by every day, not as they don't see them, but I'm saying their people are out there. So I think for us, it's really about, it's not so, you have to look at it and provide services as if this was you or somebody you loved. And when you look at it that way, it completely transforms, right? It's one thing to look at it from an objective point of view and say, okay, these people need this, 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 and that. This is what I think they need. It's another thing to say, if I'm in this position, if my child is in this position, my daughter, my mother, what do they need, right? What's important there? I think safety is a huge one. Kindness, courtesy, basic things like hygiene. There's all kinds of little things that can completely improve and uplift quality of life. But I think the most important thing is choice and options. All people don't want to live the same way, right? Some people want to live in SROs, some there's permanent supportive housing, some apartments, some safe sleep villages, some VTCs, the vehicle triage centers. And I think it's really important as we design the system, right, that we make sure that there's space for everybody, that you have really high quality services, but that you have a range so that you're addressing the different needs of people. Like Tay Youth, we spend a lot of time on, what do Tay Youth need? Transgender individuals, all kinds of folks. You have to look at the entire spectrum and really go beyond, just kind of thinking, to putting yourself, as Brett said, having these conversations with the community and really drilling down and saying, what is important about quality of life? And how do we create those things and create options for people so that they can find a place where they feel the most comfortable and can really thrive as much as possible, in their housing that they select. So again, I think it's more, as Brett said, going to people, really understanding what their needs are, what the barriers have been, and then just using a common sense approach to trying to break down those barriers and to create these things that people need. It's really not very difficult. People try to make it sound difficult, but as a provider who has a ton of models out there and very successful, it's not that hard. All you have to think about is, if this was me or somebody I loved, what would I need to be here? And I think when you start from that place, it completely transforms everything. And I think that if we had more of that thinking across the board, we would see the quality of living conditions and places like really improve. I think we've done good, but I think we have a lot further to go.
I think you just hit the nail on the head there. It's not rocket science. That brings us to the end of our hour. It went by really fast. We didn't even touch on half of the things that I had down on my list, and we had a lot of great audience questions that I wish we could have gotten to more. But thank you so much, Chris and Lena and Brett, for joining me today. I was really interested in all of your responses and everything you had to say. And thanks so much, Tipping Point, for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Erin. We appreciate it. And thank you all to our panelists. And thank you all to our attendees for joining us this afternoon. We know that solving homelessness in San Francisco requires people like you to show up for your community. And one way that we can do that is to take action now by signing a petition to improve and extend the eviction protections in the state of California.